Hiya everyone and welcome to my presentation. So first of all, if we take a quick look at the speaker here, Norman Shapiro is a distinguished professor of literary translation and professor of Romance languages at Wesleyan University, writer in residence at Adams House, Harvard University, and multi-award-winning translator. This quote is taken from an interview with Dennis Kratz in the Translation Review Journal in 1986, and what he's essentially saying is something I know most of us can agree on, that we have intuitive expectations of what a good translation is. It should read as being fluent and be free of any non-native elements. However, translators will always find themselves pulled one way by wanting to create fluent-sounding text, and simultaneously wanting to honor the author's intentions, the so-called imperfections in Shapiro's metaphor. Should a translator's own ego, personality, skills, and experience leave its mark on a text, or should he or she show complete faithfulness to the original author's intentions? In truth, this varies enormously between text types. Some demand near complete equivalence of lexical meaning, where the translator is seen as, in the words of Basnet-McGuire, not a creative artist, but as an element in a master-servant relationship with the source language text, whilst other texts allow the translator in some cases to take on an author-like status with more room for creative expression. This varies enormously depending on each translator's school of thought as well as the text in question. Essentially, what we as translators must critically evaluate is the suitability of source versus target-oriented approaches. Different strategies include faithful versus free, formal versus dynamic equivalence, domestication versus foreignization, word for word versus sense for sense. These binary pairs are competing strategies of how best to transfer meaning from one language to another. While one stays true to the source, but in doing so somewhat alienates the reader of the target text, creating something like a wall between author and reader, the other distances itself from cultural norms of the source text in order to be accessible to the readers of the target text, thus creating Shapiro's glass. Two polar opposites, a translator's job is to strike the balance. In the early 19th century, the focus of translators was often the wide circulation of a text rather than its contents. Some, such as Dante Gabriel Rossetti, saw the work of a translator as mechanical and involving a great deal of self-denial and stifling of creativity. At the opposite end of the spectrum, Edward Fitzgerald wrote about how it amused him to improve Persian poetry in the translation process. A binary divide emerged. Was the translator a servant duty-bound to recreate the source text with little to no creativity, or did the translator have no duty to remain true to the inferior source language culture? These conflicting opinions are a product of the growth of colonial imperialism in the 19th century and are both responsible to an extent for the lowly, often ambiguous status of translators in the 20th century. By domesticating a text through replacing all foreign references, culture, history, food, grammatical structures, with that of the target language culture to make it seem like it's an original text, the reader is blissfully unaware that he or she is reading a translation, making it very much like the pane of glass Shapiro alluded to. However, as a consequence, the reader learns and understands nothing about the language or culture that produced that particular story or document. Some translators have been criticized, by Venuti for example, for westernizing and appropriating literature to make it readable, but at the expense of the source culture. At what point does this then become an adaptation? Arno Schmidt's Evening Gilded in Gold, translated by John E. Woods from German to English, is a heavily domesticated text. Woods was allowed much poetic license to recreate the author's style, rich with visual and acoustic puns not easily replicated in English, and is indignant when he is given little to no credit for creativity. He sees himself almost as a co-author, rarely using literal translation, but developing a text which captures the style and spirit of the source text in order to bring this work to an English-speaking audience. Indeed, translators who favor target-oriented approaches can feel empowered to some extent, improve the work of others for their target language readers. Moving on to the other end of the continuum, foreignization. In Venuti's The Translator's Invisibility, he denounces the concept that a translation should not appear to be translated, despite using Shapiro's hypothesis as an opening to his book. In this foreignizing technique preferred by Venuti, where a target text does not pretend to be a source text, there is no interference from the translator, no getting between the reader and the original writer by replacing source language cultural norms with target language cultural norms. He describes the effect of translation as violent and criticizes the way foreign texts are appropriated to suit the cultural, economic, and political agendas of the receiving target language reader audience. Edward Sapir argued that no two languages can represent the same social reality, and Levy, the great Czech translation scholar, argued that omitting source language cultural norms was immoral. Peter Newmark suggested overcoming this conflict of remaining loyal to the target text with his prescriptive method of semantic versus communicative. This means translating as literally as possible and only deviating from that when necessary to best represent the source text, language, and culture. However, this method can alienate readers who do not have pre-existing knowledge of the original author's culture and can require extensive footnotes, in addition to creating overly literal, clumsy-sounding translations. To conclude, I do agree with Shapiro's statement, but find it overly simplistic. Whilst being overly literal is a flaw in itself and leads to awkward translations, I think accessibility must meet faithfulness to the original author's intention somewhere in the middle of the continuum. Accessibility is the most important aspect of literary translation, in my opinion, which makes Shapiro's metaphor valid and true. The scratches and bubbles he mentions, such as jarring grammatical structures that don't work in the target language, or cultural or historical references that will only fall upon deaf ears, are extremely difficult to navigate when trying to faithfully replicate a text. The translator must evaluate how crucial to the overall text meaning these cultural nuances are, and achieve a balance where grammar conforms to the rules of the target language, whilst the meaning of the source text is relatively undisturbed. This hypothesis is helpful for new, inexperienced translators who may not want to deviate too far from the source text, resulting in clumsy target texts. As Shapiro puts it, the translator's ego and personality will always play a part in translating, but we must try our best to stay faithful to the source text and honor the author's original intentions, or in Basnet-McGuire's words, preserving surface meaning and surface structures, but not to the detriment of the readability of the target text. We must do our best not to confuse a translation which does not call attention to itself with a translation that has deviated too far from the original text, a largely individual and interminable task, as the value of a translation is culture-bound. A perfect definitive translation cannot exist, as each translation is tied to the current economic, social, and cultural climate of the audience for which it was created, hence some texts having been translated differently hundreds of times. It is an act of collaboration and negotiation, and striking the balance between fidelity and readability is an ever-changing, dynamic process. Whilst our pane of glass today may show no imperfections, that is not to say that scratches and bubbles won't eventually, perhaps inevitably, come to the surface. Thank you all for listening.